August 19, 1944. East Prussia. Inside a dimly lit command bunker at Hitler's Wolfschanz, General Oberst Alfred Jodl leaned over a map littered with red pins and fading optimism. Reports from the Western Front painted a bleak picture. Patton's Third Army was advancing faster than any German staff officer believed physically possible. Yet Jodl, steeped in decades of military theory, remained confident. "The Americans," he muttered, "have outrun their fuel." His analysts had done the math, over 400 miles from the Normandy beaches to the spearhead. No army could sustain that. Within days, they predicted the American tanks would stall, and Germany would regain its footing. What Jodl could not see beyond the thick concrete walls was the beginning of a logistical miracle that defied military precedent. Hundreds of miles away, across the rolling farmlands of France, an unending procession of trucks was already thundering eastward. Their headlights, blazing through the night in open defiance of blackout rules, cut glowing ribbons of light across the countryside. These convoys weren't random. They were the arteries of a bold new idea, a high-speed supply chain unlike anything ever attempted in warfare. It was called the Red Ball Express, an operation so unconventional that German intelligence refused to believe it was real. Nearly 6,000 trucks, manned by over 23,000 drivers, most of them African-American soldiers in a segregated army, would move over 12,000 tons of supplies every single day. In a war of tanks and aircraft, these men were about to prove that trucks could win battles. To the Wehrmacht, the numbers didn't add up. German divisions had seen their own offensives collapse on the steppes of Russia when supply lines failed. Their panzers had starved for fuel. Their infantry froze waiting for ammunition. Every German commander believed the same iron law: no army could outrun its logistics. Yet the Americans were about to violate that law with industrial arrogance. What Germany's finest minds failed to grasp was that the United States had turned industry itself into a weapon. While German factories struggled to rebuild from bombing raids, American assembly lines produced more trucks in a week than the Wehrmacht could in a year. And so, as Jodl recalculated his figures inside his Prussian bunker, the roar of American engines echoed across northern France. Those engines were rewriting the laws of war, and the Germans hadn't yet realized they were already losing. But what began as an act of desperation, a gamble to keep Patton moving, would soon become the most extraordinary supply operation in military history. And the men driving those trucks were about to challenge not only the German army, but the very prejudices of their own. August 25, 1944. A requisitioned French chateau near Le Mans hummed with tension. Inside, Lieutenant Colonel Laurent Ayres of the Motor Transport Service faced a skeptical crowd of officers surrounded by maps, fuel charts, and empty coffee cups. The figures were brutal. Patton's Third Army was burning through supplies faster than any force in history. Traditional systems, depots, rail lines, scheduled convoys had collapsed. "Gentlemen," Ayres declared, his voice cutting through the murmur, "we're not waiting for supply to catch up. We're going to create a highway that never sleeps." The plan sounded insane. 2 parallel one-way roads stretching from Cherbourg's beaches to Patton's front line. One for loaded trucks moving east, one for empties returning west. No stops, no schedules, no blackout discipline. Trucks would drive 20 hours a day, headlights blazing even at midnight. Any vehicle that slowed below 25 miles per hour would be shoved into a ditch. Ayres called it the Red Ball Express, borrowing the name from railroad slang for priority freight. Colonel Charles Thrasher, commanding the advanced section of the communication zone, studied the projections. "We need nearly 6,000 trucks," he muttered. "We don't even have that many running." The numbers defied logistics textbooks. But within 36 hours, trucks began rolling. The impossible was already happening. Most of the drivers were young, tired, and black, soldiers from segregated quartermaster units who'd been denied combat roles but now carried the war itself on their backs. They christened their trucks with names like Patton's Blood Bank and Detroit to Berlin Express. Within days, they had their own rules, slang, and rituals. When engines failed, they fixed them on the road. When roads broke, they made new ones. When someone fell asleep at the wheel, the next man took the wheel without stopping. German reconnaissance pilots soon began radioing home in disbelief. Continuous vehicle column, headlights visible for 20 kilometers. No spacing, no blackout. To them, this wasn't discipline. It was madness. But it was American madness powered by gasoline and grit. They didn't understand that the Red Ball Express wasn't just a supply line, it was a statement. A declaration that American industry and individual will could bend even physics to its purpose. What the Germans saw as chaos was actually controlled velocity, an orchestra of engines conducted by determination. But the Germans were watching, and what they saw made no sense. How could an army move faster than its own fuel supply? The answer would shake their entire belief in warfare itself. From his operations post in East Prussia, General Major Siegfried Westphal, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, studied the latest reports through a haze of cigarette smoke. His analysts had done the arithmetic. 12 American divisions advancing 400 miles from the beaches, each consuming 1,000 tons of supplies per day. 12,000 tons every single day. Even if they had perfect roads, Westphal said, tapping his pencil on the table. And no mechanical failures, which is impossible, they still cannot sustain this for more than 48 hours. To the German mind, physics itself guaranteed the American collapse. But while the Wehrmacht relied on assumptions, the Americans were relying on engines. By August 26th, 5,958 trucks were already rolling eastward. They formed a metal river across France, hauling 12,500 tons of fuel, food, and ammunition daily. The Red Ball Express wasn't theory anymore. It was thunder. German aerial reconnaissance couldn't believe what it was seeing. Continuous convoys, headlights on, 5-minute intervals between vehicles. The reports read like fiction. Major Edgar Feuchtinger of the 21st Panzer Division personally observed from a ridge near Rouen. The enemy operates a supply system beyond comprehension, he wrote. They drive at night with lights on, no camouflage, no fear. They act as if they have infinite fuel. That was precisely the secret: infinite fuel. The Americans had built what the Germans hadn't imagined possible. Pipelines under the sea. Operation Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, pumped gasoline directly from Britain to Normandy. To the Germans, it was magic. To the Americans, it was engineering. Forward fuel dumps sprang up every 25 miles along the Red Ball route. Tankers refueled trucks like pit crews in a race. If one engine failed, another took its load. When bridges fell, bulldozers built new ones. The system wasn't elegant, but it worked because it never stopped. German logisticians called it reckless. Field Marshal Model called it suicide. But as the rumble of American convoys echoed through the French nights, German units began to realize something horrifying. The Americans weren't bound by the same limits. They were redefining war itself. But numbers tell only half the story. The real engine of the Red Ball Express wasn't made of steel or gasoline. It was human. And the men behind the wheels were about to prove just how far they could drive history forward. They were young, mostly in their early 20s, many barely out of high school. Soldiers whose skin color had confined them to labor units, now handed the most critical mission of the European campaign. Over 23,000 men, 3/4 of them African American, would form the beating heart of the Red Ball Express. In a segregated army that denied them equality, they were about to prove their worth not with rifles, but with relentless motion. The conditions were brutal. Drivers spent up to 20 hours behind the wheel, often running on black coffee, cigarettes, and benzodrine pills to stay awake. The convoys rolled through rain, mud, and rubble, their engines roaring through bombed-out villages where every bridge or turn could mean death. When exhaustion hit, they tied ropes to the steering wheels to keep them steady, or drove with one hand while slapping themselves awake with the other. Yet morale remained astonishingly high. These men gave their trucks nicknames and personalities: Hitler's Hot Rod, Black Magic, Georgia Peach, Patton's Blood Bank. They painted slogans across the hoods and bumpers, laughing in the face of war. Some even blasted jazz records from the cabs as they barreled past stunned French civilians who had never heard such music before. There were no rules except one: keep moving. If a truck broke down, it was fixed on the spot or shoved into a ditch. If the road was blocked, drivers made a new one. Maintenance crews worked like battlefield medics, cannibalizing wrecks for parts, swapping engines in under an hour. Mechanics slept in their overalls beside the road, waking to the next emergency. Accidents were constant. Some drivers fell asleep and never woke. Others died in fiery crashes or under collapsing bridges. Over 300 men were killed during the 82-day operation. But they kept going because they knew what was at stake. Every mile they drove meant Patton's tanks could keep fighting. Every gallon of fuel delivered was another nail in the coffin of Nazi Germany. And for these men, there was something deeper than victory. Every mile of that road through France was a declaration that the same America which denied them equality still depended on their courage. They weren't just driving supplies, they were driving history itself. But the Red Ball Express wasn't just moving supplies. It was moving faster than any army in history. And soon, the Germans would discover that no defense, no calculation, and no doctrine could stop what was coming down those roads. By the final week of August 1944, German intelligence began to realize something was deeply wrong with their assumptions. Reports poured into Army Group B headquarters describing American armored columns advancing at 40 to 60 miles per day, double the theoretical limit of mechanized warfare. Patton's Third Army wasn't slowing down. It was accelerating. Every mile gained was fueled by an invisible lifeline the Germans couldn't comprehend. General Heinz Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg himself, dismissed the reports as exaggerations. No armored force can sustain 60 miles of advance per day, he declared. Engines would fail, fuel would run dry. But when intercepted American radio transmissions confirmed these speeds, disbelief turned into dread. The Germans had mastered tactics, but the Americans had mastered logistics. In the German war rooms, officers recalculated endlessly. They had fought in Russia, where mud, cold, and distance strangled entire armies. They had watched their own panzers grind to a halt when the fuel ran out. They assumed the same fate awaited the Americans. But now, through aerial reconnaissance, they saw the impossible. Convoys of trucks stretching 20 kilometers, headlights burning through the night, as if the Americans didn't fear air raids or exhaustion. Field Marshal Walter Model summarized it grimly. "We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an industry." German intelligence captured tonnage records, 12,000 tons daily, 5,958 vehicles in operation, and dismissed them as propaganda. But when captured American documents confirmed every number, the realization sank in. The Red Ball Express was not only real, it was unstoppable. For frontline German soldiers, the sound of the Red Ball became a kind of haunting. At night, they could hear the endless growl of engines beyond the horizon. The trucks, one Wehrmacht soldier recalled, never stopped. They sounded like thunder rolling forever. It wasn't just fuel and ammunition the Americans were bringing, it was inevitability. To the Germans, it felt like facing a machine that didn't sleep, a civilization that had turned every factory, every worker, every drop of fuel into momentum. For the first time in the war, German commanders began to whisper a forbidden thought. Perhaps this enemy could not be stopped. But the Red Ball Express wasn't just breaking records, it was breaking minds. As Germany struggled to understand how this machine kept moving, they would soon discover the one element their doctrine could never calculate: human improvisation. The Germans called it madness. American officers called it momentum. By early September 1944, the Red Ball Express had evolved into a living organism, improvising, mutating, and solving problems faster than any manual could predict. When roads vanished under bombing, drivers made new ones. When bridges collapsed, engineers built detours overnight. When engines died, mechanics stripped parts from wrecks and shoved them into working vehicles within an hour. It wasn't elegant. It was chaotic brilliance. German officers who observed the operation couldn't make sense of it. Their entire doctrine depended on precision and hierarchy. Strict planning, perfect maintenance, flawless discipline. The Americans seemed to operate by breaking every rule. Trucks ran overloaded, engines overheated, drivers ignored schedules, and yet the system accelerated instead of collapsing. They violate all principles, one German report noted. but they succeed through sheer numbers and improvisation. Each day, about 1,800 trucks broke down. Normally, that would cripple any army. But the Americans had planned for failure. Mobile maintenance units, floating repair shops on wheels, roamed the route, fixing trucks where they fell. The crews worked with battlefield triage precision. 15 minutes to repair or the truck was pushed off the road. Parts were cannibalized, engines swapped, tires replaced by the thousands. They didn't aim for perfection. They aimed for movement. When traffic choked the main highways, drivers invented alternate routes, painting red circles on signposts to mark their new paths. French civilians watched in astonishment as convoys detoured through their villages, turning narrow cobblestone streets into roaring rivers of steel. The roads trembled under the weight, but the trucks never stopped. The Germans, obsessed with precision, couldn't comprehend this kind of chaos. To them, it looked like undisciplined insanity. To the Americans, it was freedom, the power to improvise without waiting for orders. Junior sergeants made command decisions that would have required a German colonel's approval. Every man on the road was both driver and strategist. By September 5th, the Red Ball Express was moving 13,000 tons of supplies daily, fuel, ammunition, rations, and spare parts, at speeds that defied theory. German reconnaissance flights reported, "Convoys operate day and night without pause. This is not warfare. This is industrial movement." They were right. The Red Ball Express had become an assembly line on wheels. But beneath that roaring chaos was a price. The men driving those endless miles were running on exhaustion, caffeine, and sheer will, and soon, the Red Ball Express would begin to break not from enemy fire, but from the limits of the human body. By mid-September 1944, the Red Ball Express had become a test of endurance as much as engineering. The trucks kept moving, but their drivers were breaking. Men had gone days without real sleep. Some took pills to stay awake, others simply refused to stop. They drove through fog so thick they couldn't see their own headlights, through rain that turned roads into rivers of mud. Every sound, the engine's growl, the rattle of cargo chains, became part of an endless rhythm that blurred days into one continuous roar. The strain was brutal. Accidents became routine. Trucks overturned on narrow bridges, engines caught fire, brakes failed on steep descents. Over 300 men died during the operation. Drivers crushed under their own vehicles or burned alive delivering supplies that would win the war. Yet replacements arrived almost immediately. There was no time to mourn. The next convoy always waited. Fatigue played tricks on the mind. Drivers reported hallucinations, seeing phantom headlights where none existed, hearing voices through the static of radios that weren't on. Some swore they saw trucks that vanished into fog, only to reappear miles ahead. The Red Ball Express was becoming something almost supernatural, an unending convoy that blurred the line between machine and man. And yet, morale refused to die. The African-American drivers, men often denied even a seat in a white restaurant back home, understood exactly what they were proving. Every mile they drove was defiance. Every ton they delivered was a rebuttal to the world's prejudice. When officers told them they couldn't make it, they simply laughed and kept rolling. Their camaraderie became their armor. They sang, traded jokes, and shared rations with French children along the route. In those fleeting moments, surrounded by war, they rediscovered something rare: dignity. The Red Ball Express was no longer just an operation. It was a movement, powered by human endurance and unshakable pride. Behind the roar of 6,000 engines was something the German generals never calculated: a force stronger than fuel or machinery. The will to prove that no matter the cost, no matter the exhaustion, the road would not end here. But as the drivers fought exhaustion, the Germans fought realization. Their best generals were now facing a truth that shook the foundation of their war: that America's greatest weapon wasn't its tanks or planes, it was its capacity to keep moving. By the second week of September 1944, despair was spreading quietly through the German command. Field Marshal Walter Model, known as the Führer's fireman for his ability to salvage collapsing fronts, now faced a new kind of disaster. Not a breakthrough of tanks or paratroopers, but something invisible, mechanical, and unstoppable. An army that refused to pause for logistics. Captured intelligence files described an operation so vast that even German mathematicians dismissed it as impossible. Over 12,000 tons of supplies daily. 6,000 trucks in rotation. Fuel consumption so immense that entire divisions could have been powered by what the Americans used just to move gasoline. It cannot be sustained, Model wrote. No army possesses such reserves. But it was being sustained by willpower and Detroit steel. The Germans began to call the Red Ball Express the Ghost Road. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed headlights stretching for miles, day after day, night after night. They do not hide, one Luftwaffe pilot reported, because they no longer fear us. That realization hit harder than any bomb. Field Marshal von Rundstedt tried to rally morale, insisting that the Americans would soon reach their culminating point, the theoretical limit of supply. But his own operations staff whispered otherwise. The Red Ball Express had made the idea of limits obsolete. The Americans, one officer remarked, have abolished distance. At the front, German soldiers began hearing what they called the engines of doom. The steady, low hum of thousands of trucks in the night. They could not see them, but they could feel the vibration in the ground. It sounded like thunder that never stopped, one infantryman recalled. It was the sound of a nation too rich to run out of anything. For the first time, the Wehrmacht's elite began to grasp the truth. This wasn't just war. It was industrial civilization in motion. America had weaponized abundance itself. Every factory worker in Detroit, every mechanic in Kansas, every driver on the Red Ball route was part of the same offensive. And against that, the German army, disciplined, proud, and starving, had no defense. But as the Red Ball Express roared toward victory, it carried something even greater than fuel or ammunition. It carried proof that freedom itself could outproduce tyranny. And soon, even the German generals would admit, they hadn't been defeated by tanks or planes, but by trucks. By October 1944, the Western Front had transformed into something unrecognizable to German commanders. The once feared Wehrmacht was now fighting not just soldiers, but a moving empire of engines. American convoys were everywhere. They thundered through liberated towns, rolled past stunned villagers, and poured supplies toward the front faster than the Germans could destroy them. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, among the most respected German tacticians, studied reports of the Red Ball Express and shook his head. "We prepared for everything," he told his staff. "Enemy tanks, air power, invasions. But we never prepared for this, for an army that builds a new world wherever it goes." German prisoners began repeating a chilling refrain to their Allied captors. "We lost when we understood your trucks." Captured officers confessed that their intelligence units had tracked every convoy, every supply column, and still couldn't comprehend how it functioned. "You waste what we would fight to protect," one said, "and yet you never run out." Behind the numbers was something deeper, a revelation that warfare itself had changed forever. While the Germans had perfected the art of destruction, the Americans had perfected the art of movement. Their trucks weren't just vehicles. They were extensions of factories thousands of miles away, connected by an invisible thread of mass production. When winter came, the Germans expected the convoys to stop. The roads turned to ice, snow buried bridges, and freezing rain made every mile treacherous. But the trucks never stopped. Chains went on the tires, alcohol poured into the radiators, and the Red Ball Express kept rolling, through blizzards that had once paralyzed entire German armies. In the end, even captured German generals conceded the truth. They had not been defeated by American tanks or planes, but by American logistics. The Red Ball Express had made the impossible routine, turning fuel, steel, and human grit into victory at 35 miles per hour. But the story didn't end on the battlefield. The Red Ball Express would shape not just the war's outcome, but the world that came after it. Its legacy rolled far beyond France, into the highways, industries, and freedoms of the modern age. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, much of Europe lay in ruins. But scattered across the French countryside, the deep tire ruts of the Red Ball Express still scarred the earth. Tracks carved by 23,000 men who had kept an army alive through nothing but courage, caffeine, and gasoline. The war had ended, but their story had only begun. Historians would later call it the most successful logistics operation in military history. 412,000 tons of cargo, 122 million ton-miles, 5,958 trucks running day and night for 82 days. It cost $100 million, a staggering sum then, yet it shortened the war by nearly half a year. Every day the Red Ball Express shaved off saved thousands of lives. But for the men who drove it, especially the African-American soldiers who formed its backbone, the operation meant more than victory. They had fought two wars, one against Hitler's fascism, and another against prejudice in their own ranks. In muddy fields of France, they proved with every mile that courage knows no color. General Eisenhower himself visited the convoys, stunned by their discipline and endurance. "These men," he said quietly, "are winning this war as surely as any rifleman." 3 years later, their example would help pave the way for desegregation in the U.S. military. The Red Ball Express had done what politics could not: prove equality through performance. When those drivers came home, they didn't leave the road behind. They built trucking companies, highway systems, and America's post-war logistics industry. Veterans of the Red Ball Express founded transport empires, trained new generations of drivers, and helped design the interstate network that would one day stretch from coast to coast. The highways of peace were born from the roads of war. Decades later, when historians asked surviving German officers what surprised them most about their enemy, they gave the same answer: not your tanks, not your planes, your trucks. They finally understood that America's greatest weapon wasn't speed or firepower. It was the ability to move. On the 50th anniversary of D-Day, the U.S. Postal Service issued a single stamp, a GMC Deuce and a half, headlights blazing down a dirt road beneath the words, "The Red Ball Express, 1944. At the ceremony, one aging veteran summed it up best: "We didn't carry glory, we carried everything else." The Red Ball Express proved that logistics is not support, it is strategy. That freedom's strength lies not in perfection, but in persistence. And that sometimes, the road to victory is paved not with medals or monuments, but with sweat, steel, and 6,000 trucks that refuse to stop. In the end, the German generals were right about one thing: amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. And the Red Ball Express? It didn't talk. It roared.